Hello everyone, in this episode of Motive Garage presented by Sparesbox, we start the JET200 comeback tour. Now, for those of you new to our channel that don't know about JET200, a little backstory. I bought it in 2003. It was a budget-built streetcar because I had no money. It did auto sell on Streetcar of the Year in 2005, then became an Ignition DVD project car, got highly developed into version 2, which was unveiled at the Summer Nats, still the only JDM styled car to do that. Had its first Fast Force cover in 07, became a Fast Force project car, then got totally redeveloped when we started Motive DVD into a Time Attack car with version 3. It then got an overhaul into version 4, which is basically what you see behind you. It's had some aero help from Andrew Brilliant, CS Engineering totally redid the car, and then we set out to try and be the quickest S chassis at Weld Time Attack and Open Class, which we did in 2015 with a 1 minute 33.7. After that, the car took a little break due to time and money more than anything else. Then we set out to do a VE head conversion with Red Sun, had a couple of small issues more associated with the bottom end, which we'll talk about shortly. And basically after that, well, life gets in the way, other project cars, work, etc. But now, thanks to Sparesbox sponsoring the car and Weld Time Attack announcing they are happening in 2021, to put a rocket up our bums here at Motive, and we're going to get JET200 back on track, and we're going to bring you guys along for the ride to see its development as we head to Weld Time Attack. So as you can see, the engine is ready for assembly for JET200. But many of you are probably asking what happened in the last 12 months. Well, let's go back a little bit further to when we did the VE head conversion. Basically, we used the original bottom end when we did the VE head conversion, and we had a GTIR oil pump which didn't flow enough to activate the VE head properly. So it's my bad. Well, it's not really anyone's fault, but we had to pull the engine out, change the oil pump. Now, Nitto said they were going to develop a SR20 billet oil pump, which was stronger and obviously more pressure and flow, so we waited for that. At the start of last year, that pump arrived, so we stripped the engine down and started to get it ready. But basically the snowball effect happened. Everything that we changed required something else to be changed. So firstly, we discovered that the Nitto pistons that were in it didn't have recesses for the valves, so it wasn't going to work with our VE head combo that we had anyway, so we needed new pistons. We were able to reuse the Nitto 2.2 litre stroker crank and the Nitto rods and ARP rod bolts. They were perfectly fine to reuse. But the next thing I thought is, well, if we're going to rebuild this engine, we might as well change a few other things. We needed to change the factory main caps because the thread inside them is an area where it cracks and they're pretty weak. And then I also thought, you know what, we should probably wedge or weld the block to give it some extra strength. So I had the block welded, but it seems that the block was pretty much already out of round and the welding made it that little bit worse, which meant the block could no longer be used with 86.5mm pistons. It needed to be bored, and I didn't want to go 87, so I had to get a new block. Red Sun got me a Virgin SR20 block, and I dropped that off to Duncan and Foster Engineering at the start of this year and got all the machine work done, which I'll run you through right now. So what do you need to build a tough 600 plus wheel horsepower Time Attack SR20? Well, without going billet, we've basically done pretty much everything you need to do to one of these blocks to be able to handle circuit work and obviously a fair bit of power. Now, looking at the bottom of the block, one of the weakest parts of an SR20 is the main caps. The main caps can move around or walk, and also because they have a little thread in the top to help remove them, it's a weak point and they crack. So the first thing we had to address was replacing the main caps, and we got some Plasma Man billet main caps. Obviously, we added to that with a Plasma Man billet brace, which basically ties all the main caps together. So what does this do? Well, the factory main caps can move, flex, etc., while the billet ones can't. So therefore the bearings won't move around, and you don't have to worry about premature bearing wear or, even worse, a bearing failure. If the main caps can move, it means the crank can flex as well. So the whole idea of having the billet main caps and the brace or girdle is that you just don't get any movement now of the tunnel. So the crank can't move around, the bearings can't move around, and they can survive at big RPM. So The brace and the main caps, very, very important. Basically anything over 350 kilowatts in an SR20 that does sustained circuit work or drag racing or whatever, you are going to have problems with bearings staying into it and problems with the crank and stuff moving around, and even main caps can crack. So very important upgrade. Obviously we need ARP 2000 main studs to clamp down on it. We obviously need more clamping pressure. If you have a look at the Plasma Man brace, you'll notice it doesn't actually tie into the block itself, and the reason for that is SR20s are an alloy block. They're going to move around and flex a little bit, so you actually don't want to tie in this brace to the block like you would with an RB. So it just ties together all the main caps. So when the sump goes on, the bolts go through the brace and into the block itself. The brace acts like a little bit of a spacer, so there'll be a tiny little bit more oil capacity as well, which doesn't hurt. So when it goes to the machine shop, what do they have to do to make all this work? Well, when you put new main caps on, or even just tighten up the factory caps, you have to re-tunnel bore the block. So the guys at Duncan and Foster Engine Reconditioning, they tunnel bored and tunnel honed our block. They also check the bearing clearances for us. What bearings are we using? We're actually using King bearings in this. So the King Race Series bearings is what Matt from Red Sun has decided he wanted us to use. So they're already in there now. They've all been checked and dummy assembled. Matt will pull this all apart again, final inspection, final clean. But essentially, that's what happened in the bottom. So new caps, new main studs, a new brace, and then new bearings, tunnel bored, tunnel honed. So on the other side of the block, what needed to be done? Well, being a virgin block, it needed to be bored and honed. We have 86.5mm pistons, so it needed to be bored out slightly and then honed. And then there is a cross-hatching design that we program into the computer. What design did we use? Well, it's a little bit of a secret with us, Red Sun and Duncan and Foster, and with Nitto, based on the piston design. But put it this way, you can't just use any old crosshatch design in any old engine. You need to do the crosshatch design to suit the application. The other thing we did on this side is we wedged the blocks. If you have a look in here between the cylinders, you can see the water gallery hole on either side here, and there's usually a slit in between here, so water can travel the entire way around the bore. But what happens is, you can imagine a big power, the bores want to expand. So what people do now is they used to weld, but now they wedge. The reason they don't weld the deck here is because if you weld it, it can distort the block because it's alloy. So we put a wedge in here, and basically it's a piece of metal, it's a wedge, and it gets forced into there with an interference fit so it can't move. And essentially what happens is now the top part of the cylinder, for the same depth as the wedge, the top part of the cylinder is basically now a Siamese bore. So that basically gives it more strength. We've discussed this in other block videos, and that is when you have a Siamese bore, because the pistons go up and down at different times, essentially the bore thickness now goes from being what it was from here to the gap to being from one bore to the other. So by wedging the top of the SR block, you add a lot of strength to the top of the bore, which is pretty important once you start making big power, because these things, being an alloy block and having a relatively thin bore, have a habit of basically expanding the cylinders. They go around, and then obviously that can lead to a head gasket failure. So once the wedge was in, we obviously had to get the block decked as well. So Duncan and Foster did the engineering work on that. And one important thing with an SR20 you have to remember, you must deck the block while the oil pump is fitted up, because the oil pump sits in line and the head goes on top. So a lot of people actually forget that and causes massive sealing issues with the head. So you must get the block decked with the oil pump on the front. And the last thing that we had to do on this side of the block is we increased the size of the head studs out to 1/2 inch. Why do we do that? Well, it's so we can get better clamping force onto the block to keep the head gasket together. So that's everything on our SR20. 1/2 inch head studs, bored and honed, wedged, decked, billet main caps, billet girdle, main studs, and then tunnel, bored and honed. So all of the machine work on the block has been done by Duncan and Foster Engine Reconditioning, and it's ready to go off to Red Sun for assembly. But before we do that, let's have a look at the other parts. So the rotating assembly is pretty important when it comes to building a strong engine, and obviously we work with Nitto Performance Engineering. And here's a fun fact, this crank and this set of rods have actually been in the engine of this car since 2011, when we first built the engine with Croydon Racing Developments. It is a Nitto 2.2 litre billet stroker crank, obviously knife edged, counterweighted. It has better flow through the crank to get to the bearings than what the standard one does, and it uses the wider GTIR bearings. 2.2 litres in capacity, better balance, stronger, able to rev harder, handle more power. So pretty logical choice. The guys from Duncan and Foster Engine Reconditioning also balanced the crank. They had it crack tested and inspected, and it came up perfect. So durability proven pretty well. So the con rods for this stroker kit are the exact same ones we had in the car since 2011 as well. Perfect condition. We did put some new King race bearings in it just to be on the safe side, and we replaced the ARP rod bolts just to be on the safe side. There was nothing wrong with them, but might as well put fresh ones in. What is new for this build though is the new Nitto pistons. Obviously these are the new design pistons that they've done in conjunction with CP, with different gas porting in the side, different ring design, and obviously the recess that you can see here that's cut for the valves. Obviously with the VE, there's a fair bit of lift. We've gone even bigger, so we need that valve relief. These are also lighter and just a better design, more modern design essentially with better technology. So looking forward to getting this back in. This will handle 10,000 RPM and basically more power than our block will handle. So we're not going to have any problems with the bottom end. As we said, King Racing bearings is what we're using in our SR20 with Matt from Red Sun Motorsports recommendation. We're still using ARP half-inch head studs, which are going to be going into this engine. And here is the new latest and greatest SR20 Nitto oil pump. Now we actually have a totally separate video that we're going to be releasing about this oil pump once it's in the car and running and tested, but essentially like they do with the RB, Nitto has created their own housing and they have their own Nitto billet oil pump gears and billet backing plate. The whole idea of this, you can adjust the pressure as well. It'll allow you to use it on any SR20. That'll give us the strength to handle big RPM and it'll give us the oil flow and pressure that we need for a competition SR20. So you've seen the bottom end, the machine work and all of the parts. Essentially, it's ready to assemble. So it's off to Red Sun Motorsport for Matt to put together. We'll be filming that entire process so you can see the tips, tricks, and what goes into a big horsepower competition SR20. Now the car was a running car before, so we're essentially going to put it back together with the new engine, get it running, run it in, and set a baseline for the car at the track. Probably go to Wakefield first and see where we're at. Our first goal is to go sub-60s at Wakefield, and then basically we'll be competing at World Time Attack. We're no longer looking to try and be the open class leader because the new rules in that category allow for suspension far beyond what the stock silver is, but we want to keep JET200 an actual S chassis, still using the factory rear subframe, factory front subframe, and basically only using parts or doing mods that you guys can do to your car. We want to keep the car relevant, and basically everything in the car is something you can put into your street car. The other thing we're going to be doing is re-wrapping the car with a whole new livery thanks to Sparesbox, and we're going to be unveiling the car with its new look at GTR Festival at Sydney Dragway on the 29th of May. See you there.